So in this video, I'm going to take you through what section B looks like. First of all, I'm going to give you some advice about what to revise for section B, and then we'll start to look at the individual questions and then start to look at some particular examples with answers. So what classic studies or theories do you need to revise? So because this is year 12 and you haven't done the learning approach, what we're going to do is just focus on the first three. So we've got social, you've got to learn Robber's Cave. You need to know that inside out and back to front, particularly the evaluation is a really good thing to focus on. For the theories, you want to look at obedience and then prejudice, so agency, social impact, social identity theory, realistic conflict theory. For cognitive psychology, you are looking at Baddeley. And again, as with Sharif, you really want to be making sure you know this study inside out, back to front. You need to know your AO1 in lots of detail. You need to know your AO3 really, really well. For the theories, you are looking at the main memory theories that we cover, the multi-store model, the working memory model, which is short-term only, and then the two long-term memory models, episodic and semantic memory, reconstructive memory, and schemas. For the theories, you also should make sure that you know evidence behind them to support them, and also some counter evidence as well. So that's really important that you're able to do both the AO1 and the AO3 for the theories, and particularly have some evidence to back things up. For biological, it's RAIN for your classic study, so that's PET scans of NGRI murderers. And for the theories, you've got the aggression theories, so brain structure, evolution, and hormones. I've put Freud in red italics underlined because I want you to remember he's not a biological theory, so you can use him as an alternative or a counter argument. We've got the CNS and the process of synaptic transmission. We've got recreational drugs, and we've also got how neurotransmission or neurotransmitters work as well. So there are two main questions in this area. Question 3 is an unseen study, and you are going to see two parts of this question. You've got a 2-mark methods question. Quite often that's on data, and really importantly, that has to link to the study fully. Again, try and avoid those generic answers. We've also got a 6-mark short question, which is effectively taking a theory, so the theories I mentioned on the previous slide, and using that to explain the study's findings. How far can that theory explain those findings? How far can it not explain them? What other alternatives could there be? And you need to have evidence. So that's why I mentioned the classic theories on that previous slide. The structure of that 6-marker, the easiest one, is to do something like this. 3, application of the theory to the study's findings. You'll see that in the example. And 3 times giving evidence and justification for that application. Again, I will take you through an example of how that works. You want to have at least one counter argument here to ensure that you access the highest marks possible. You do not need a conclusion or a judgment, because this is not an essay, because it's below 8 marks. Question 4, they're going to take 2 classic studies. So again, refer back to that previous slide where I mentioned what they were. And it's going to be a 16-marker, and that can look a little bit challenging, but I'm going to break it down for you. It's broken down into 6 AO1, so 6 description marks, and 10 AO3, so 10 evaluation marks. You want to make sure your AO1 and your AO3 are linked together, so whatever it is that you are evaluating, make sure that you've described it first. The AO3 is going to be focused on a particular issue or debate. Again, I will take you through an example of this so that you are ready to tackle this in the Year 12 mock. I will only ask you to focus on one particular issue and debate this time. When you get to the real thing, you'll obviously have to focus on all 10 or 11. You'll have to focus on all 11 issues and debates. You need to have judgment and assessment all the way through this essay. Your AO3 should be balanced, so there should be evidence, counter-evidence, argument, counter-argument. The structure, easiest way to think about it, is where you can define the issue or the debate. If it's a debate, define both sides. So if it's about nature, you're also going to define what nurture is. You're going to tackle each study in turn. Do not bounce around. You're much, much better off if you're trying to access those higher marks, keeping things as structured as possible. So we're going to start with the first study. We're going to do AO1, AO3, plus minus. We're going to repeat that process 3 times, and that hopefully will give us 3 AO1 marks for that study and 4, 5, 6 AO3 marks for that study as well. It's not a hard and fast rule, but if you stick to a structure similar to this, and you also make sure you have pluses versus minuses in your AO3, then you won't go far wrong. You're then going to do a mini judgment or mini assessment of how those studies demonstrate or don't demonstrate that particular issue or debate. You're going to do exactly the same thing for study 2. So notice I don't go study 1, study 2, study 1, study 2. I do all my study 1s first, and then all my study 2s second. So effectively, you are doing 2 essays in one. You don't need to compare the studies together. You don't need to start mixing them up. Keep them separate. And then you want a final overall balanced judgment or assessment, in which you can mention both studies, but you don't, again, need to compare them in any way, shape or form. So we're going to start with question 3, and this is the unseen study that they're going to ask you about. So in this case, we've got something that calls itself instigators and an unethical act. Our study examined the psychology of instigators. Instigators are people who surround an unethical act and influence the wrongdoer without directly committing the act themselves. So in other words, these are people who actually influence somebody to do something they shouldn't, but don't actually commit the crime themselves. Student confederates were recruited to instruct participants to commit an unethical act. The unethical act was to vandalize a book in the university library by writing the word pickle in pen on a specified page. There were 3 conditions in the study. 2 student confederates instructed an unknown student to carry out the unethical act. 1 student confederate instructed a close student friend to carry out the unethical act. And the 3rd condition is 1 student confederate instructed an unknown student to carry out the unethical act. And the first question is this 2 marker that you will always see, which is something to do with methods. Sometimes that's to do with data. In this case, it's an ethics issue. And again, we've got an explain question. Explain 1 ethical issue that could be violated in the instigators and unethical act study. Now, the thing you need to be careful again is don't be generic. emphasize that over and over again. It is really, really important that you always link fully to the scenario. So I'm going to show you the answer, or an answer, and I'm going to start by breaking this apart again. So here is our first part, and this is our identify. And it's our AO2, and it says the student being asked to vandalize the book would not be aware that they're in a research study. So in other words, you've got an issue about somebody participating but not knowing they're participating. So that's quite a nice obvious one to get from this. It's absolutely linked to the scenario, vandalizing the book, the students, can't be anything else. To get the second mark, we need to justify that and say what that's going to do. So here we go. Notice again, I've got a connecting word to get me to my AO3. So this is my justify. Quotation mark. So therefore, there may be a lack of informed consent as the student is unaware of the study aims and has not been given permission or not given permission to be involved. And again, if what you did is you just gave something that looked a little bit like this, you are risking either just getting 1 mark or possibly, very probably, getting nothing because you haven't fully linked it to the study. Yes, you've mentioned there's a student there, but what's that student doing? What are they being asked to do? What are the aims of the study? So it isn't enough to get you even 1 mark, probably. So that's how we would answer our short question in this particular case. And again, this can be any methods question they choose, same as in questions 1 and 2. And again, avoid generic answers. So this is question 3B. It's always a 6 marker, and it's always about how you link the findings of the study that they've given you to a particular theory or a particular area in psychology. So in this case, we've got this table. Just spend a bit of time looking at that and trying to get your head around what it's saying. You've got the percentages there of the student participants that vandalized the university library book. It looks like if you've got 2 student confederates instructing somebody they don't know to carry it out, that you've got 87% vandalizing it. If somebody is trying to influence a close friend, so one person is trying to influence a close friend, it's 80%. But if you look at it, if it's one person trying to influence somebody they don't know, then it drops to 62%. And the question says, explain how far social impact theory can support the findings of the instigators and an unethical study. And sometimes this is linked to research. It will say, explain using research from social impact theory. In this case, it doesn't do that, but I would always assume that you need to have learned the research supporting and counter for your key classics theories here to support you. So I'm going to show you how this breaks down. And it breaks down into 2 main sections. So the first section is applying social impact theory to the study. So we've got to basically say what is social impact going to do for us in this study. So let's see if we can work that out a little bit together. So let's see what my first one says. Social impact theory would agree with the findings that two sources would have greater social impact than a single source due to there being a greater number of social sources instructing the student. So we are clearly showing we understand what social impact theory is doing, but we're also showing that we are linking it back to the scenario. It is not a bad idea to also, if you can, quote the data. In this case, this answer doesn't, but it's absolutely fine. I would perhaps, if for future answers, would actually be quoting that data back at them just to show it. But again, this is a good answer. Let's have a look at the second one. The strength of the relationship between source and target is important and can explain why the unethical act was more likely to be carried out if there was a close relationship compared to when there was a single unknown confederate. So if you look at it, what that's saying is that that relationship, when it's strong, so a student confederate, close friend, that ends up with much more obedience, 80%, than when it's weaker, a student confederate versus instructing an unknown student. So again, what we're doing is we are applying it directly to the study, showing that we understand social impact theory and showing that we can use the data to help us. Again, you could quote the data at them as well, but this isn't a explain a conclusion, so it's not strictly necessary to give the data. Here we've got one that does have data. The theory would support a higher number of unknown sources, giving a 25% greater obedience, 87 minus 62, than when there was a single unknown source acting on the target individual. So this is an example of using the data, but it also still uses the theory. The more sources you have, okay, acting upon a target, the more obedience you're going to have in social impact theory. And this study supports that, if you look at that difference between 87% and 62%. So that's the first part of it, and that would get us our 3 marks. The other 3 marks are really to do with trying to link this and say how far social impact theory could explain it. Here we've just linked social impact theory to the study and said social impact theory says this and this is what the study says. So what we're going to do is more or less evaluate it, and we're going to evaluate it with a bit of evidence. So this is a judgment or a justification of how far social impact is a suitable explanation for the findings. So let's have a look at our first one. And here we go. The Saldikis and Jackson Zoo study supports the findings of the instigator study because it showed that obedience increased with the strength of the sources. Now, I want to emphasize that bit, but that element allows you to go, this is what this study does, it supports it because, and it then goes on and develops that a bit more by saying there was more obedience for the same confederate wearing a zookeeper outfit compared to wearing a t-shirt and jeans. So it effectively gives us a full justification. Let's have a look at another one. And it says, however, agency theory could equally explain the findings as the participant may have been acting on behalf of the Confederates in an agentic state to vandalize the book. And again, this is fully linked to the study, but it is a counter argument. And that is key to getting the 6 marks here, because what you want to do is to have some elements which are supportive and some elements which are not supportive. Let's have a look at the final one. However, social impact theory cannot explain why more sources have a greater social impact, and it is just a predictive model rather than an understanding of why conformity or obedience in this case occurs. Again, that's a counter, and there's nothing wrong with having two counters and one support here. This is not an essay. There's no need for a conclusion here. But what you do need to get is that you've got two separate sets of marks. The first set of marks, your AO2, is about applying social impact to the study. And your second set of marks is basically saying how far, what's the evidence that it is going to work, what's the evidence that it isn't going to work as an explanation. And that's key. And again, I would emphasize the need for having research there to support it. And that research could come from a study like Siddiqui's and Jackson, which is part of the AO3, or it could come from any of your named studies, whatever might be appropriate, whether it's Milgram, Berger, Sharif, whatever works in terms of the question you're looking at. So in part B of your mock exam, you're going to see a question which is a 16 marker, and this time it will be about whether two of your classic studies are scientific or not. And what I want to do is to give you some idea about the sorts of things you need to consider when thinking about whether a study is scientific or not scientific. So here are some things that we need to think about. What controls are in place? For example, Sharif was able to control a lot of participant variables by matching up the boys he used in terms of their backgrounds, in terms of their ages, obviously in terms of their gender. But he couldn't control all the aspects of the situation he was in because he was using a real life scenario. He was using a summer camp. So we've got both high levels of control so we've got arguments for and against Sharif here in terms of it being scientific in terms of its controls. Another thing you might want to think about is how far can that study establish cause and effect? The more experimental a study is, the more it can do this. If a study is more correlational, then that makes it much, much more difficult for it to actually say that one thing caused the other. In fact, it can't. And one thing that science would say is that what you want to do is to run an experiment in which you can establish what you did had an impact on what came out. So in other words, your IV changed what you measured in your DV. You also need to think about, can the study be repeated or replicated? It might be very, very difficult to do that because you might have a very particular set of circumstances. For example, Sharif's Robber's Cave might be considered to be pretty unique. So might any case study. Has it been repeated? Did they get the same results? You also need to think about how objective a study is. Objectivity is the level to which the experimenter isn't actually interpreting their own results and putting their own spin on it. In order to be scientific, we want to be objective. We want to be able to say, these are the numbers we got, this is what we measured, this is exactly what it means. That's pretty straightforward with something like a PET scan in rain, but it's much, much more difficult if you're looking at something like ratings of liking for other people, as Sharif did. We might also consider whether a study is reductionist or holistic. Reductionist is this idea, if you remember, of trying to find the smallest explanation possible for a behavior. So if we consider something like rain, that might be the way a particular brain structure works. So the amygdala, or the size of the amygdala, or the way that the prefrontal lobe is working. The more reductionist something is, the more scientific it is considered to be. Some studies, though, might go down a more holistic route. They might start to look at lots of different factors, whether it's the cognitive factor, whether it's a social factor, whether it's an environmental factor. And they might combine all these things together, in which case that starts to impact what we might think of it in terms of it being scientific. We should also think about how valid a study is, and we need to look at both internal and external validity. Internal validity is things like the controls that are in place, so particularly for experiments in a laboratory. Internal validity essentially means, are we measuring what we think we're measuring? If we set out to measure the duration of short-term memory or the encoding in long-term memory, are we actually doing that? External validity is how much that behavior that we've just measured actually applies to the real world. And that's quite a tricky one, because if we are measuring, for example, the behavior of brains in rain study in a PET scanner, how far can we say that is true of those people's behavior outside in the real world? And finally, just one idea to think about is how generalizable are the results? Can we take what our findings and apply them to different groups of people, different populations, different genders, different ethnicities, different countries, different cultures? Can we take a sample which is probably going to be not that huge, so for example in rain it's about 42 people, and can we generalize that to other people claiming NGRI in the rest of the world? The more generalizable the results can be, the more scientific we might think of the study as being. So in front of you is the question you're actually going to see in the Unit 3 mock. And I'm going to show you how to get started with it. And then what I want you to do is to make sure that you've revised Rain and Sharif enough in terms of how scientific they are, using the elements I just discussed on the PowerPoint. So let's break this down a little bit. Evaluate the classic studies by Rain and Sharif in terms of their scientific status. So we've got to think about some of those things that we talked about earlier. That could be validity, it could be whether it's replicable, it could be to do whether it is controlled, is it experimental? All those sorts of things can come in. Now, you don't have a huge amount of room here. It's 16 marks and you've got 2 studies. So if we break that down, AO1 is 6 marks. That's 3 marks per study. And AO3 is 10 marks. That's 5 marks per study. And in AO3, you need a balance of strengths and weaknesses, and you need some conclusions. So you can get some detail in there, but what you can't do is turn this into everything I know about Sharif or everything I know about Rain. So what I'm going to do is show you how you might put together one bit of the Sharif part of this essay. So here's some AO1. Sharif et al. Used a summer camp in Robbers Cave State Park to investigate the formation and reduction of prejudice. Straightforward. AO1 tells the examiner that you know what this study is about, nice and clear. So what we're going to do is we're going to match that up with some AO3. He's used a summer camp, so maybe there's an issue with using this kind of real life setting. So let's see what we can do. So I'm going to bring in some AO3. And this is actually a criticism in terms of its scientific credibility. The use of a real life setting with a lack of controls in Sharif et al. Means the study could be considered less scientific. Okay. So there's actually nothing there that's particularly tricky, I think, as long as you've revised Sharif. What we're now going to do, though, is we're going to do a strength. And if we can do something like this, we can do a bit of AO1 to demonstrate our knowledge. Then we can do a strength-weakness pair. If you really want to go for it, you can go strength, weakness, strength. So you could, do a triple. But in this case, I'm only going to do the two. I'm going to bring in a strength. So here's my strength. However, Sharif did carefully match his participants in terms of gender, age, and academic ability. Therefore, the study did try to reduce the impact of participant variables, making it more scientific. And that shows the examiner that you are, first of all, understanding how controls here can be positive and negative. So there's controls here in terms of participant variables, but there's less controls in terms of it being a real life setting. You've shown both sides of this argument. So you've got some balance in your AO3, and also it's showing that you understand this study because you're talking about that careful matching up in gender, age, academic ability. So it's not generic. What you're going to do with this is you're then going to use all those things that I talked about on the PowerPoint previously to come up with another couple of these AO1, AO3 combinations. So you're going to repeat that pattern about 3 times. You don't need a plus and minus pair each time, though. If you do an AO1 and then an AO3 positive and then an AO1 and an AO3 negative, that's okay. You can't always have a positive and negative. As long as you've got some strengths and some weaknesses, that's great. The more you can balance them against each other, that's even better. What you then want to do is add on a balanced conclusion. Now, I sometimes call these mini conclusions, and do them as you go along in the essay, because what can happen is that people wander along, they do all this stuff, and they forget the conclusions, and then suddenly it becomes a bit tricky to get themselves into the higher grades. So what does our conclusion need to look like? Well, it needs to be balanced, and it needs to just use the overall strengths and weaknesses that you've mentioned. So you might go, overall, Sharif could be scientific because, use all of your ideas about why it's scientific. You just have to summarize them. However, the Sharif study might not be scientific because, and again, summarize the main AO3 criticisms you have. What you're then going to do is you're going to do exactly the same thing for Rain. You're going to repeat that entire process for Rain. And finally, a big piece of advice, particularly for accessing the higher grades, is don't jump around in terms of your ideas. Don't go, I'm doing a bit of Sharif, now I'm doing a bit of rain, now I'm doing a bit of Sharif again, now I'm doing rain again, I'm going to go back to Sharif. Don't jump around. Do each study in turn, and what that will do for you is give you a logical structure and will give you much more chance of accessing those higher marks. So your final question in the Unit 3 mock exam is question 5, and this is about explaining behaviour using different themes from psychology. It's always a 12-mark essay, and what you can see in front of you is an extract from your PLC, and it's always going to say something like evaluate how far this social psychology can explain this behaviour, or to what extent can biological psychology explain their behaviour. It'll always be something of that nature. Nearly always it's an evaluate. It's always AO1 4 marks, AO2 4 marks, AO3 4 marks, so it's always got that structure. There's an essay structure in front of you where I am suggesting that what you do is you go AO1, AO2, AO3 plus minus, repeat that 3 to 4 times, and then have a balanced conclusion at the end linked to the scenario. Best way to revise for this one is to focus on the main themes from Unit 1, and the basic elements you can see there are below. Don't worry about learning because you haven't done it yet, but for example, social behaviours influenced by interactions with others, so we've got theories of prejudice and obedience. Cognitive is all the models of memory, and biological is all that stuff about brain structure, synaptic transmission, genetics, evolution. Freud, even though he's not a biological explanation. The one thing I would really emphasize to you is to try and stick to your guns. The question nearly always tries to force you out about trying out an explanation like biological, when a different theme like cognitive might be better. You need to force the links to the scenario from the required theme and then use other themes as an alternative. So that's part of its difficulty. So what I'm going to do is take you through how you might go about structuring one of these and show you a little bit of a particular question. So here is a very typical question 5. It has a scenario and it's going to ask you to apply an approach or a theory to that scenario. So this is what it says, that companies that enable people to meet potential romantic partners are becoming increasingly popular. Some companies include a series of questions during registration that assist them in recommending which people are a potential match. Mandy decides to use a company to meet a potential romantic partner and is recommended a number of matches who have similar interests. Mandy's mother disagrees with this approach and tells Mandy that romantic relationships are purely biological in basis. Evaluate how far the biological approach can explain human behavior, such as meeting potential romantic partners. You must make reference to Mandy's situation in your response. So the way to think about this question is to think about it in terms of its different assessment objectives. AO1, 4 marks, what does the biological approach have to say? So showing off your knowledge. AO2, 4 marks, how might this apply or not apply to what Mandy and her mother are saying? AO3, 4 marks, evidence and counter-evidence for using the approach. Your AO3 has got to be balanced, and you have to have a conclusion at the end. You can use an alternative explanation. For example, you might mention cognitive towards the end, but only do this once. Don't suddenly go, well, I disagree completely that it's biological and I'm going to talk about cognitive for the rest of the essay. Don't do that. Use it as an alternative, but otherwise stick to your guns about the approach being asked, in this case, biological. You're going to repeat that structure 4 times with a final balanced conclusion. And again, I know I've said this 3 times already, but stick to your guns. The scenario will often feel as if a different approach would be better, even if that scenario might work better in terms of cognitive or social. Still use what you know about biological psychology. Still stick to it. So let's break this apart and show you an example of how you might do this. And again, a bit like your 16 marker, I'm just going to show you a bit of this because you need to be working and revising on the rest. So AO1, evolution is the process of change in all forms of life over generations. However you're going to define it, that's a mark scheme definition. You might have your own, but it's just defining it. You could easily do hormones here. You could talk about what brain structure involves, etc., etc. AO2. Evolutionary psychology theory suggests that Mandy's mother is correct. So notice I'm linking it to the scenario. Romantic relationships are really about survival and continuation of the species. So people choose potential partners that can provide healthy children. Can't argue that this isn't linked to the scenario. It's talked about Mandy, her mother, romantic relationships. Great. My next paragraph is I've got a bit of a choice. It's going to be AO3, but whether I make it a positive AO3 or a negative AO3 is kind of down to me. My suggestion is that what you do is you do AO1, AO2, and then a positive, AO1, AO2, then a negative, whatever it is you might want to do, but keep them in these blocks. It just makes life a little bit easier. So here's an example of an AO3 positive. BUS, which is a study that you'll find in your textbook, found that across 33 countries, males preferred younger and more attractive women. This supports evolutionary explanations of romantic behavior because it shows that males focus their attention on women more likely to be fertile, increasing reproductive success. So it's evidence for using the biological approach to explain this scenario. Or you could go a slightly different way. You might go, well, I'm going to do a negative here. So your negative might look a little bit like this. Evolutionary explanations are impossible to test directly, so most of the research is either correlational or fossil-based. Therefore, it's difficult to assess how much romantic relationships are really due to evolutionary factors. Again, it's linked to the scenario. It's not really about evaluating whether the biological approach is good or bad. It's really about saying how much can it explain this particular scenario. So that's how you would start to go about this question. You would do that about 4 times. Now, notice the word or here. You don't want to be overkilling the AO3 because AO3 is only going to be worth 4 marks here. So if you went 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, if you did that 4 times, a couple of them were strengths, a couple of them were weaknesses, that would do it. Let's think about the ending though. At the end, you want a conclusion, and that conclusion needs to be balanced. So this is what we might do. So biological psychology can explain romantic behavior in that, and you summarize your positives, but then you're also going to summarize your negatives. However, it cannot explain whatever it can't explain, and a cognitive approach or whatever it might be a better explanation because, and there's your AO3 negative. So that's how you would go about it. So you would repeat this section either with an AO3 positive or an AO3 negative 4 times. So you'd repeat that section 3 times, either with an AO3 positive or an AO3 negative. Once you've done that, you come up with your final conclusion, summarizing your overall strengths and weaknesses in terms of how far it can explain what's going on in the scenario. And that's your final question for Unit 3. And the best way, absolute best way to revise for this part of this question is really just to revise Unit 1 really, really well. I've said that all the way through, but particularly on this bit, if you understand the Unit 1 theories and approaches, this becomes much, much easier, particularly if you've got some evidence behind it. And you can use whatever you like. You could use rain. You could use any of the work on hormones. If you wanted an alternative, you could have Freud. There's lots of things you could do here.